Our housing stock in Fort Worth, historic is Victorian, arts and crafts, bungalows, things like that. Yeah, we're going to talk about Fort Worth, but we're going to talk about how cities evolve and houses come about and styles happen. If you just walk down that street, you can go 20s, 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 that's 30s, that was an infill one. Oh, that's 1990s, that's the 80s, right? In this 30-year time period, right, so much changes. The war, design changes, the way our houses look and why they look the way they do changes. Hey guys, I'm Brent Hull here at League Real Estate. We're at an original schoolhouse from the 1890s. We're going to be talking about historic houses and neighborhoods here in Fort Worth. What happens to our houses and our neighborhoods to cause them to look the way they do? This is Tarrant County or Fort Worth in 1876. Okay, the railroad arrives here in 1876. That's a big deal. You know, you think about Texas, okay, and you know some of the southern parts in San Antonio are very old. Fort Worth, because of Indians, literally North Texas and West Texas doesn't get developed until later. And so, you know, you think the Alamo's 1836, we become a state in 1845. You think about when population happens here, and you think about architecture across the United States, we start much later. So 1876 is during the Victorian era, right? And so our earliest buildings are Victorian. Our housing stock in Fort Worth, historic is Victorian, arts and crafts, bungalows, things like that. Then period revival and ranch style houses. In 1888, there's a map done by, I think it was one of the railroad companies, but Fort Worth becomes this major hub, right? Railroads are a big part of, you know, Fort Worth, you know, technology and industry. I mean, BNSF is here and railroads were very important. Why? That's how things got here. I've read a lot of books on railroads and the expansion in the West, and literally the first thing they would put on a railroad heading west was wood so that people could build houses and things like that. And so we've worked on courthouses, a lot of them around the state. In Waxahachie, we did the Ellis County Courthouse. It had white, yellow pine windows, white pine doors, okay? We're like, why is there two different woods? Well, they had brought the wood down from St. Louis, the doors down from St. Louis, shipped in by rail car, but the windows were made here in Texas, and so there was different kinds of wood. And this is 1891, so now you see the courthouse here. The expansion happens really south and west is where our neighborhoods end up, and this is kind of a population thing in Fort Worth. Notice there's no one in Fort Worth in 1850. Tarrant County, there's a little bit. 1880, 1890, look at the growth here, right? This 246% growth. And then if you look at kind of three population booms and then corresponding, you know, reasons why there are, you know, the railroad and cattle. One of the reasons railroad stopped here was to take cattle north, right? So it became a major railhead, major cattle head. Instead of taking, you know, cattle up the Chisholm Trail, they stopped in Fort Worth and shipped them from here. Fort Worth grows a ton during this 1880, 1890 time. Oil is discovered Spindletop, 1901, down in Texas. And so the oil and cattle boom is still, you know, really prevalent here. This is, you know, arts and crafts, bungalows, period revival things. And then the defense industry during the war and everything else is another big growth. And so there are population correspondings, and therefore when people are moving here, they need neighborhoods, they need houses. The Victorian architecture we have here is related to the technology, the railroad coming here, cattle industry. We have a lot of Victorian, or we have some Victorian architecture. 1900s, 1920s, that's the arts and crafts and bungalows. The oil again and cattle in here is period revival architecture. And then of course the ranch and mid-century stuff after that. Neighborhoods that develop, Quality Hill, Arlington Heights, Samuel Heights, right? This is 1890, did you say, right? You think about the Bryce House, there's some other Victorian houses in Arlington Heights. It was kind of the westward expansion. There was a lot of stuff going on here. You know, and if you think about Texas and Fort Worth just as that centerpiece, the town grows like this, right? The closer you get to downtown, the more Victorian architecture you see. And then the bungalow neighborhoods are kind of the next one, and then the period revival and then the ranch as it expands out. If you look at Fairmount, right? It's one of the largest bungalow neighborhoods in the U.S., if you didn't know that. This collection of bungalow neighborhoods, they were working man houses, right? They speak to, if you think of the 1900s and 1920s, who lived there, right? These are people who worked in the stockyards. There was actually a trolley car that went right down to the stockyards from Fairmount, but they needed cheap, quick housing, and that area just exploded with housing during, and that's what those people were here too. The cattle and oil was the reason why Fairmount is there. Not really high style. There's some higher style houses there, but they're very simple houses. If you look over to Park Hill, a little bit later, right, this is that neighborhood off of Park Hill Drive, Medford Court, Winton Terrace. Period revival things, right? This is obviously an English Tudor style. This is kind of a Beaux-Arts, Italian Renaissance kind of thing. This is a higher end neighborhood. It's interesting as you look at this neighborhood, there was a lot of double lots, right? And so there was houses that had wide lots on them. World War II happens, Depression 1929, World War II, we get in there in 41, 42. We don't get out until 46, and there is a break that happens in this neighborhood, and then you'll drive around, you'll all of a sudden see ranch-style houses and other houses, just because those people were selling their side lots, or as that neighborhood got put together, it never got finished out. And so there was lots still for sale. And so some people had side lots, some people were just, that lots never happened. And so those infill housing that happens later, right, is the war's over, the prosperity's coming back, defense industries coming back to Fort Worth, and you begin to see these things infill. Park Hill is kind of the best example I see, a real small example of a development from the 20s or 30s that dies because of the Great Depression and World War II, and then comes back to life again. And you see, these ranch-style houses next to these beautiful period revival houses, and you're like, what happened here? There's a book by Anders Jawani, his wife, Suburban Nation. It's a fascinating book about the difference between historic neighborhoods and new neighborhoods. And basically, when they built Seaside in 1980, early 80s, it was the first development to take old house ideas or old neighborhood ideas and build a new neighborhood. That's why the cars are parked in the back. There's front porches. It's a walking environment. Because they looked back at historic neighborhoods and said, what's happened today is you got your gated communities, you got your industrial complex, you got your malls and shopping centers, and then there's the school. And you have to drive to each one. The car is required to go around to these places. And they're saying that's not historically how it was done. Historically, you had these neighborhoods that you walked to and that everything was, close by. And so I'm just going to take a picture of, Park Hill, Berkeley Place, Mistletoe's up here, Fairmount's here, right? And if we just look at this as an example of that early, way things used to be done, you begin to see examples of, local shopping centers, right? This is right there in Park Hill and University, designed in the kind of the Tudor Revival style, right? It's 1920s, 1930s. It's meant to look like the neighborhood, right? You have that period revival era. And so this would have been, shopping in stores that you could have walked to, that you would have these neighborhoods. And if you think about, Park Hill right here, these nice houses go across the street into TCU, they're stepped down a little bit, right? But everybody's living pretty much close by. The gated community, right, if you want to call it that, of Park Hill, you've seen the posts and the pillars and that. It's not gated, but it's defining the neighborhood, right? If you go around the corner a little bit over here onto Forest Park, again, we have apartments now, right? For people that can't afford the same thing, cross the street, you go into Berkeley, right? But living together within these same communities, schools are right close. Lily B. Clayton's right there. You can walk to these schools. Your kids could ride bikes. It didn't require that you got in a car to go anywhere, and everybody lives close by. The reason why Seaside, they have nice houses, but they also have back houses and guest quarters and things. And so you can go rent those things now based on the size of your thing. The idea is that everybody lived in the same community. You think about over on Park Place, this was a fire station, right? This was a 1920s fire station, meant to look like a house, meant to look like it was part of the community. Again, kind of done in the bungalow style, right? Kind of appropriate to that. This storefront too is kind of a Mediterranean revival kind of style. Again, architecture at this time was, there was a cohesiveness that happened between commercial and residential, and that these houses and buildings all looked, were from the same design book, right? This is the Firestone Apartments. This is a commercial building, right? Firestone, national company, was designing their buildings in this, Persian revival, Mediterranean, revival style, right? That defined their architecture. And if you look at these books and you can go back, we actually are in a Nabisco company, and Nabisco had a, company architect that designed their buildings, and our building looks very similar to other Nabisco buildings around the country. Same is true with Montgomery Ward's. They did their buildings. They have one in Denver, they have one in Kansas City, and there's advertisements in their catalogs of the 5 or 6 other places that had a Mediterranean revival store, right, as all part of that same architecture. 1920s, 1960s, what is the difference between these two, right? Well, this, right? The garage on the front of the house, right? An attached garage on the front of the house versus a detached garage. Essentially, in this 30-year time period, right? 40-year time period, so much changes. The war, design changes, and so neighborhoods naturally change. The way our houses look and why they look the way they do changes. The whole world of architecture in one slide, right? Greek and Roman things back here up to 300 AD. Gothic architecture is 11 to 1400, right? The Renaissance happens around 1450. And then kind of in America, right, going forward, you have Georgian architecture, 1740 to 1760, 1770. Federal architecture, Victorian architecture happens right before the turn of the century. Arts and crafts period revival, and then the ranch, right? So Fort Worth basically is, this and forward. We just don't have that early stuff here. That's where we live. What we'll see though, as we look back at Georgian, Federal, and Greek Revival architecture, these things show up in the Colonial Revival styles, right? So the reason you'll see columns on the front of houses and this symmetrical design with the center door is it's copying these styles, right? It's called Colonial Revival. When we were colonies, before we became in the United States, right? That colonial style is why it's called that. The Victorian architecture, right after the Civil War, incredibly ornate. We don't have necessarily these. These would have been houses that were built in the 1870s. We're here in 1870, but we don't have this kind of wealth, right? We don't have the kind of money that could have afforded and built neighborhoods like this that you would see. This is what you see in Fort Worth, right? This is the Fairview house right there on Bryce, I think. Is it Bryce? Yeah. But that's, this is a very nice Victorian house. It's made of brick. You've got custom stone and other details in there. The carriage house, right? The garage is separated. It's not part of the house. You see Thistle Hill. This is Summit Avenue. And if you think about the neighborhoods where Victorian architecture lives, right? A little bit in Arlington Heights, Summit Avenue, right? This is Summit Avenue that used to be, this was called Quality Hill when it was up there, and where the Presbyterian church is, there was another historic house about 15, 20 years ago they tore down. But this was a neighborhood of this type of houses right up on the top called Quality Hill. You think about Pennsylvania Avenue, Thistle Hill, the Women's Club, those Victorian houses, right? Again, you're looking at a tight circle around downtown Fort Worth where these houses would have been. There's one or two Victorian houses in Fairmount. It's not as elaborated as this. I think it's wood-sided. It's not stone or brick. And then Samuels Avenue, again, that circle around the other side of downtown, right? There's where our Victorian architecture lives. If you think about the arts and crafts period, this is the bungalows, prairie style, craftsman style, right? So this is a green and greenhouse out in California. That was kind of this arts and crafts bungalow. In Fort Worth, this is just a street there on Arlington Heights. I think this is Clover. These little bungalow type styles, and you think about the neighborhoods that those are in, right? They're in Arlington Heights a ton. Like I said, Fairmount's a huge one. Berkeley, and then of course Mistletoe. North Fort Worth, there's a lot of stuff because of the cattle up there. Any other areas I missed as far as where those bungalows would be? Oakhurst, yeah, and period revival too in Oakhurst. Yeah, that's right. And so there's that's where those things live for us. Period revival. This is there on I think this is on Pembroke, and you think about the neighborhoods where this lives: Berkeley, Mistletoe, Park Hill. I said Oakhurst, TCU. There's a lot of period revival houses in TCU, and of course in Arlington Heights, right? So you begin to see, the places where we live and why they grew up and why they look similar, right? And then of course, when you think about the defense industry and the ranches in Ridgely and Tanglewood, and I know there's others, but they spread out. A lot of infill building taking place too. This idea of why buildings change, why buildings look the way they do, and I talked about that big change with World War II happening. Essentially, in this period of time, right, this happens here in Fort Worth and what we're going to look at, you have two things happening. You have a change in design focus, right, and a change in building focus. And this is important as we look about houses that are built today and kind of what's happening. 1926, the Art Deco movement is named after an event in Paris called the Arts and Decoration Exhibit. In 1926, it was meant to be a cutting-edge focus for France to kind of grab back design. The Bauhaus school closes, right? That was the German design school where Gropius and the other guys were working. It was a very influential German design school. Hitler hated it, right? Hitler liked classical architecture, and then Gropius leaves Germany and joins Harvard in their design school. And Harvard, being one of his leading design schools, it is heavily influenced in the modern style. And you think about Farnsworth, which was a Mies van der Rohe house built in Illinois, is that house, right? So this is 1946 that was built, which is kind of one of the first modern houses built in America. But these people, Gropius, the Arts Deco, Mies van der Rohe, these Germans that are coming over here. And the other thing that should be looked at too is that as we think about classical architecture, one reason why modernism takes over the schools is because Hitler was such a gross historical figure, right? His crimes are so incredible. The fact that he stood for classical ideals and classical buildings, there was a rejection of that, right? And so they would talk about in these design books that to build a building, to build a classical building was fascist, was promoting things that, weren't the ideals that were new. There were these fake skins put on building, hiding sins, right? And so you end up having this rejection of thing, again, as we think about buildings today and what's going on. On the building side, okay, you have this huge, so this is the design side, this is the building side. On the building side, the Great Depression happens in 1929, okay? The most houses ever built in America at this time was 1926. It was the peak. Builders talk about 1 million houses a year, new houses a year, kind of being an ideal number. I think we're just hitting that number now after the recession. They were building 1 million houses a year in 1926. It was slowly stepping down, and by 1929, and certainly after that, the next 10 years, right, are just a lost time. We in Fort Worth actually have a decent number of houses built after the Great Depression. One is because of the railroad and technology, and that was here. There's a great book on Art Deco Modern that talks about the building projects and the government money that was allotted to Fort Worth and Texas for building. You think of the T&P Railroad Station and some of the other things that were going on downtown that had a lot of federal money here. And so Fort Worth didn't die the way some towns did. So there was still some building going on. We enter the First World War, 1941. We come out of that war, right? And William Levitt, who had been a builder in the 20s, went and built some contract housing in Virginia for a War Department. We got to think that what he learned there, he brought back and applied to building. And those things included, he was on the cover of Time in 1949 or 48. But these were his houses, okay? His houses were incredibly small. They were built on slabs. When he was building these houses, people said they'll never sell, okay? These houses were between 500 and 800 square feet. The average size house in 1930 and 40 was about 1,200 feet, 1,400 feet. So you walk into some of these bungalows around here that haven't been changed, they're still so small, 1 bedroom. Our first house on Clark was a like 1,500 square feet, 1 bedroom, just had never been updated or changed. So the average square foot is 12 to 1,400. He's building 500 to 600 square foot houses, right? And so people said they would never sell. Well, they sold like hotcakes, okay? He would sell 1,000 houses in a weekend, okay? Like people would write the contacts for these houses. And the reason why is because all these things that changed in building, the GI Bill, government-backed mortgages, right? All those things changed. We found the plans to our house, which was built in 1930, okay? The FHA starts in about 34. They had the payments written out on the blueprints, and it was, I think, a 3-year note or a 4-year note. And it was like a $2,000 house, and she was making $800 payments a month or a year or something like that. It was crazy, right? And so you think about affordability, right? That whole 15, 30-year mortgage, that's invented in 34, 35, right? And so it's kind of the perfect storm that allowed Levitt to build houses as cheaply and fast as he did, because the government basically took away all the risk, okay? The GI Bill meant that guys didn't even have to put it down a down payment. There was 16 million GIs coming back from the war. And that's a lot of people. Furthermore, you think about these were outside of New York and Philadelphia. These downtown apartments and downtown places that they've been living, okay, hadn't been updated, right? They didn't have new updated water. They didn't have multiple bathrooms. They didn't have the advances and things that had taken place. Say you built your apartment in 1920. It's now 1945, and they haven't made any improvements on your thing, and you're paying $50 to $100 a month. Levitt comes along and says, I'll give you a new house with a yard, and it'll be, it was between $50 and $80 a month, right? And so they were like, this is crazy. We get our own house, we get our own yard with this new neighborhood. We're out of the city. This is incredible, and they just sold like crazy. I mean, think about this too. They had to teach people how to mow the grass, because people had never mowed grass before, right? And they had to teach them about, these fruit trees and the other things that they were putting in their houses. It's kind of crazy. But I'm telling you all this because we have the rise of production building happens after Levitt, right? There's no D.R. Hortons, there's no, Centex or whatever the big people are now. Those guys, he invented this whole way of building, okay? And everybody realized what he was doing and realized, and it just, building boom explodes. A production builder in 1920 built 300 houses a year. That was a huge builder, right? I have these builder developer magazines written for those guys, and they would talk about how big guys were building 300 houses a year. And he built Levittown. It was 17,500 houses, and he finished it in like 3 years. And he was doing multiple things at the same time. But you look about the difference between these two, right? You talk about the split in design, right? This is what architects and designers were doing, and this is what people wanted, right? And this is what people were buying. And so there's this, this curse of Levittown. That's the rise of production builders. You think about McMansions, that word's invented in 1980. And so what is a McMansion, right? It's just basically a big production house, right? Levitt really teaches people how to build cheap and fast. And one reason I think better houses are before 1940 than after 1940 is because of this, we learned how to build cheap and fast after then. And I've got books that actually describe crafting houses. And the problem with houses today, speaking about the houses in the 30s, is that we spend too long crafting them. Urban sprawl happens, this loss of craft. Of course, that's my beef. We think about building now, right? So we understand, hopefully, where our neighborhoods come from, right? How change happens and what's going on. But it's still happening, right? When you think about the new technology, think about Alliance Airport, right? That with an airport and a whole community has been built around an airport, right? That this is a commercial-only airport. You can't fly, out of it. It was built for FedEx. It was built for these things, and this neighborhood has arisen because of this industry. It's no different in my mind than the railroad coming to Fort Worth, right? That you have this incredible spur and these people moving here because of industry, because of jobs. I think the technology is still spurring our growth. If you just look at the mass of people moving down from the north, that's all because of air conditioning, right? There's no reason the South doesn't start growing, as you look at models of 10-year growths, the South doesn't really start growing until after we figure out air conditioning in 1950. So it's not, Florida and things like that were summer places, right? They weren't, or they were winter havens. They weren't places that you went in the summer. And the reason Fort Worth is the fastest growing metroplex in the country is the number of houses we're building, but also because, my brother lived in Chicago for years. He just says the winters are too damn long, right? It just, it's March and it's snowing and they're just like, oh my gosh, when's this going to end? So you think about Walsh Ranch, Mira Vista, different time periods of when that happens. Mira Vista's 70s and 80s, right? If you go out there and look at that housing stock, that's a neighborhood that was, golf course boom, and all those houses, or a large number of those houses, are from that 70s, 80s period. And you can see it in their style of building. Walsh Ranch will have the same thing, right? It'll look like this period of time. I tell these guys in my videos, everything dates itself. And so you hopefully can walk around these neighborhoods. If you just walk down that street, you can go 20s, 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 that's 30s, that was an infill one. Oh, that's 1990s, that's 80s, right? But you know that the neighborhood was built and then the rest is infill and tear down and things like that. So hopefully that helps you kind of look at these houses differently now, right? That you're now can look at these neighborhoods and understand why they're there and the industry that goes with them. So what happens with house styles is that you see that technology really drives, how a town grows. Neighborhoods, based on when they were built, determines the style, right? And so all these things work together to help define our neighborhoods and our houses and the styles of those neighborhoods.